I was in business providing marketing services to technology companies for many years, so I know firsthand that it's often difficult to make and enforce project agreements between service providers and their clients. The legal system provided little help because the projects I was involved in never amounted to enough money to justify going to court. Besides that, my clients were located around the world. I've attempted to develop software that can solve this problem by defining an agreement between a service provider and a client and holding the funds owed under the agreement until specific terms agreed to by both are fulfilled. Let's fire it up and see how it works. The software makes it easy to divide projects into many phases to reduce the risk to both parties who only need to commit their time and money to one phase at a time. So we'll start by, we'll create a phase here called proof of concept, and we'll say that the initial payment is 5 ETH and the final payment is 10 ETH. And I'll explain the significance of the initial and final payments later for the phases. And now we'll define a second phase. We'll call it smart contracts. And we'll make the initial payment 8 ETH and the final payment 12 ETH. So we'll define that. So now we've got two phases defined here by the service provider, and now it's up to the client now to approve this phase structure. So we'll go to the client dashboard, and the client will approve the phase structure. So, and client approved phase structure is true, you can see up in the project status. Now, the next step is that the client needs to make a deposit in order to cover the work for the first phase. So we'll go to the client dashboard and we will deposit 15 ETH to cover the initial and final payments for that first phase. And this money is obviously going to be held by the contract. It's not accessible by the service provider at this point. So, so the client made its deposit. Now the service provider now, it's their turn to start work on this phase. So service provider starts phase one, the first phase, and let's update. And you can see that the 15 ETH that was in the client balance has moved to the escrow balance. So now that 15 ETH is accessible by neither party. It's the contract's holding it, and neither party can withdraw ETH at this point, while the service provider is working on that first phase. So let's assume that first phase goes well, and the client's happy with it. So the client will come along and approve the current phase of the project. So client approves. And now let's go back and see what happened. We'll update the screen, and you can see that the escrow balance has moved from 15 to 0, while the service provider balance has moved from 0 to 15. So the service provider has completed phase one and now is paid for phase one, now has access to those funds, and we'll go down to the service provider dashboard and we'll withdraw that 15, the service provider will withdraw that 15 ETH into his or her own wallet. And now we go back and we can see that the service provider balance is 0 because they have withdrawn the 15 ETH. Now let's look at the second phase here, and we'll have the client will submit. You can see the total payment for the initial and final payment is 20 ETH. So the client will deposit. Well, the client deposit 20 ETH to start the second phase. And so now we have the update there. We have the client balance is 20 ETH. So the service provider now can start that phase, and service provider started. So now we see that 20 ETH moves from the client account into the escrow account. So now let's we'll say that the second phase didn't go as well as the first, and the client is unhappy, and the client says, you're not doing your job right. I'd like to cancel this project. So client goes to their dashboard and says cancel project. And now let's go back we'll up, give it blocks a chance to be processed, and we'll go back and we can see what happened here is that the 20 ETH that was in the escrow when the project started has now moved. 12 of that ETH has moved to the client's account, and 8 has moved to the service provider's account. And we can see the reason here is the initial payment was 8 ETH, and the final payment was 12 ETH. So that initial payment of 8 ETH was committed to the service provider for at the time of the start of the project, while the final payment was only paid on approval, and if the client did not approve the job, then the client gets the 12 ETH back. And of course, those numbers could be subject to negotiation between the two parties. How much of each phase is comprised by initial and final payment. And now, of course, both the service provider and the client can withdraw their funds. So we'll start. See, the client gets 12 ETH back. So we'll enter 12. Oops, I'm sorry, in the deposit, we'll enter 12 in the amount of funds to withdraw. So the client withdraws 12 ETH, and the service provider withdraws 8 ETH. Of course, we get error checking to make sure they don't only withdraw what's in their own account. And now we go back here, and we see service provider's balance is 0, client's balance is 0, escrow balance is 0. And this would, by the way, this would have worked out a little differently if the service provider had been the one to cancel the project. Then the service provider would have lost the initial payment, and the entire 20 ETH would have gone to the client's account if the service provider had been the one to cancel the project. So there's an incentive to either party not to cancel the project, but rather to cooperate as much as possible to try to complete the current phase. This approach has a number of major advantages over the verbal agreements that normally govern project work today. The risk to each party is reduced. The funds are held by an impartial smart contract that releases them according to rules that have been agreed to in advance by both parties. Transaction costs, such as the cost of creating and enforcing the agreement, are virtually zero. Furthermore, embedding project agreements into a smart contract creates the potential to define large numbers of smart contracts that will unleash an army of freelancers to accomplish very large projects or goals that today can only be handled by organizations with large numbers of employees. Thanks very much for listening.